TMU, Imphal Axis, Burma Front, 11 March 1944. At 0520 hours, forward observers along the Chindwin recorded columns of the Japanese 33rd Division pushing toward Imphal. In rear areas of 14th Army, heavy anti-aircraft units stood by with Britain's principal HAA weapon, the QF 3.7-inch gun, 94 mm, a 7-man piece capable of 10 to 20 rounds per minute and effective ceilings beyond 32,000 feet when paired with late-war predictors and fuses. Designed to engage high-altitude bombers, the weapon weighed roughly 9 to 10 tons in mobile form and saw widespread service from 1937 onward. As the direct air threat waned, the Army increasingly redeployed underemployed HAA regiments for ground support tasks. The contrast was sharp. A gun born for the sky, now tasked to fight at treeline and road cut. The question was simple and operational. Could a high-velocity AA piece make a measurable difference against bunkers and light armor in Burma's campaign of 1944? A file-stamped QF 3.7-inch HAA, ordnance and carriage, landed on an ordnance desk at Woolwich Arsenal in the spring of 1928. The cover sheet was routine. Inside, the specifications were not. Bore, 3.7 inches, or 94 millimeters. Projectile weight, 28 pounds of high explosive. Muzzle velocity, 2,600 feet per second, with potential for 3,000 feet per second in improved loads. Recoil system, hydropneumatic recuperator, proven and reliable. The British Army needed a weapon that could reach bombers flying at 400 miles per hour and altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. The interwar years had made one fact clear. The next war would be fought in 3 dimensions, and cities would burn if the sky could not be defended. The Directorate of Artillery issued the requirement. Vickers and the Royal Ordnance Factories responded. By 1932, prototype mounts were under test at Shoeburyness. By 1936, production orders flowed. The gun that emerged was a marvel of balance. Its carriage allowed 360-degree traverse and elevation to plus 80 degrees. The crew of 7 could sustain 10 rounds per minute, with bursts to 20 rounds under ideal conditions. 2 principal forms were standardized: a mobile version on a traveling carriage for field deployment, and semi-static mounts for fixed defenses. Both shared the same ordnance tube, the same fire control interfaces, the same lethality. The system depended on more than the gun itself. Predictors, mechanical computers that calculated lead angles and fuse settings, transformed raw firepower into precise intercepts. Early predictors were crude. Later marks, especially those paired with radar and proximity fuses in the war's final years, pushed effective ceilings above 32,000 feet. The combination of high velocity, steep elevation, and accurate fire control made the 3.7-inch gun the backbone of British air defense. By 1939, hundreds were in service. By 1940, thousands. But the design brief said nothing about ground targets. It said nothing about bunkers, roadblocks, or mortar pits. It said nothing about jungles. The gun was built to fight in the vertical dimension, where altitude and speed defined survival. The idea that it might one day be registered on grid coordinates at 3,000 yards, firing not at bombers but at timber and earth fortifications, would have seemed absurd. Yet high performance and all-around traverse carried an unintended gift: flexibility. When the skies emptied, the gun could turn its muzzle toward the earth. By mid-war, anti-aircraft command fielded more heavy guns than there were viable air targets over Britain. The Luftwaffe had been driven back. Raids dwindled. Regiments stood ready, ammunition stockpiled, crews trained. But the threat they were built to counter had receded. The question became not whether the guns could be used elsewhere but how soon and where. A War Office summary graph told the story in a single descending line. Luftwaffe raids over Britain. 1940, frequent and devastating. 1941, reduced but persistent. 1942, sporadic. 1943, negligible. The Blitz had been broken. The strategic air offensive had shifted to Germany. British skies were quiet. Yet along the coasts and around the cities, hundreds of 3.7-inch guns remained in position, their barrels elevated toward an enemy that no longer came. Simultaneously, Cables from India Command painted a different picture. The Burma front consumed artillery at a relentless pace. Field guns, medium howitzers, mountain pieces. All were stretched thin across vast distances, appalling terrain, and an enemy skilled in fortification. The Japanese built bunkers of teak logs and packed earth, immune to light high-explosive shells, sited in jungle so dense that direct observation was measured in yards. Reducing these positions demanded weight of shell, accuracy, and volume of fire. 14th Army needed every gun it could get. The solution was already being tested in other theaters. In North Africa, HAA regiments had been retasked for counter-battery fire and harassment missions when Axis air activity declined. In Italy, 3.7-inch guns provided interdiction and area suppression, their high-velocity shells tearing through hilltop strongpoints. In Northwest Europe, as the invasion built momentum, HAA units were formally integrated into corps-level fire plans. The air threat still existed, but it no longer justified exclusive employment of every heavy gun. Doctrine evolved: dual-role thinking, flexible deployment, opportunity fires. Staff studies at Anti-Aircraft Command and India Command considered similar adaptations for Southeast Asia Command. The challenges were immediate and obvious. The 3.7-inch gun was not a light weapon. Its traveling carriage and limber weighed 9 to 10 tons. Roads in Burma were primitive. Bridges were rated for far less. The monsoon turned valleys into swamps. Logistics were a nightmare even for standard artillery. Adding heavy AA guns seemed impractical. But practicality is relative. Where roads existed, and some did, cut by engineers or inherited from pre-war infrastructure, the gun could move. Where positions could be prepared and defensive boxes at Imphal, Kohima, and along key routes offered such opportunities, the gun could be sighted. Where ammunition could be delivered, and the Royal Army Service Corps proved endlessly resourceful, the gun could fire. The question was not whether the 3.7-inch could operate in Burma, but whether the operational benefit justified the logistical cost. The answer came from a simple calculation. A 28-pound shell, fired at high velocity with precision fire control, delivered effects no 25-pounder could match. Airburst over mortar lines disrupted Japanese indirect fires. Interdiction rounds on roadheads slowed reinforcement. Direct fire, where sighting allowed, could crack strong points that resisted lighter weapons. The gun's trajectory was flat, its accuracy high, its psychological effect profound. Japanese troops called heavy flat trajectory fire like naval shells, a comparison born of fear, not admiration. By early 1944, the policy space existed. 14th Army would receive limited numbers of HAA guns for ground support, where terrain and logistics permitted. They would not replace field artillery. They would not be everywhere. But where they were sighted, they would change the local fight. A system built for altitude would be judged by its ground effect. An orders group convened at Jorhat in mid-January 1944. The room was crowded. Artillery officers, engineers, logistics planners, intelligence staff. On the table, maps marked with road classifications, bridge load limits, and proposed gun positions. The subject: integrating HAA guns into 14th Army's defensive scheme for the Imphal Plain and approaches. The engineering officer spoke first. Site preparation time for a single 3.7-inch position: 2 to 3 days, assuming engineer support, suitable ground, and no interference. Platform construction: timber balks or compacted laterite where concrete was unavailable. Ammunition storage: dug and revet, minimum 50 rounds per gun on site, with reserves at roadhead. Traction requirements: 6-wheel drive artillery tractors or heavy trucks, with winching capacity for slopes and mud. Bridge classifications: the gun and limber exceeded Class 9 on most Burmese spans. Fording or pontoon crossing would be required at many river sites. The logistics officer followed. Ammunition weight: 28 pounds per shell, plus cartridge case and propellant. A single gun firing 20 rounds per day for a week consumed over 3 tons of ammunition, not including packaging and fuses. Multiply by battery strength, add transport losses, and the tonnage climbed rapidly. The Royal Army Service Corps could deliver, but only where roads were passable and priorities allowed. HAA support would be selective, tied to critical positions and phases. The intelligence officer provided context. Japanese bunker construction in Burma followed consistent patterns. Double-thickness log walls, overhead cover of teak beams and earth, firing slits angled to resist direct fire, all-around defense with interlocking positions. Standard 25-pounder high-explosive shells often failed to penetrate or collapse these structures. Heavier rounds, 5.5-inch medium, 7.2-inch howitzer, were effective but scarce and slow-firing. The 3.7-inch offered a middle path, high velocity, flat trajectory, precise delivery, and the ability to fire airburst over trenches and mortar pits. General William Slim, commanding 14th Army, emphasized flexibility. The Burma campaign would be won by combined arms: infantry, armor, artillery, air support, and engineers working in concert. No single weapon system would dominate. The 3.7-inch HAA gun would not be a silver bullet. It would be one tool among many, applied where its characteristics offered advantage. Slim's staff had studied the gun's employment in Italy and Northwest Europe. The lessons were clear. Use it for interdiction, countermortar fire, and selective direct engagement. Do not expect it to replace field artillery. Do not deploy it where logistics cannot sustain it. Do not waste its precision on targets better handled by lighter guns. Fire control was the next consideration. In the air defense role, predictors and radar provided targeting data. In the ground role, the gun relied on forward observers, map coordinates, and optical range-finding. Direct fire sighting kits used in Europe allowed low-elevation engagement of visible targets. Time fuses, set manually or mechanically, enabled airburst over Japanese positions. Proximity fuses, VT fuses in Allied parlance, were beginning to reach the theater in limited numbers, offering devastating effectiveness against personnel in the open. Where available, they multiplied the gun's lethality. Doctrine took shape through January and February. HAA guns would be integrated into artillery fire plans where sighted. Liaison with air observation post squadrons, specifically 656 Squadron, operating Oster spotting aircraft over Burma, would improve speed to first round and adjustment accuracy. Safety arcs and coordination procedures mirrored those used in Europe. The guns would be registered on defensive fire tasks, pre-planned interdiction points, and suspected enemy assembly areas. When targets of opportunity arose, the system could respond rapidly. By early March, as Japanese forces massed for their offensive toward Imphal, selected HAA batteries were in position. They stood at roadheads in defensive boxes along key corridors. Their barrels, once elevated toward empty skies over Britain, now pointed toward treelines and ridges. The ground roll would be selective, but where the 3.7-inch was placed, it would shape the fight. The jungle did not change the ballistics. Doctrine and opportunity did. At 0520 hours on 11 March 1944, forward patrols confirmed what intelligence had predicted. The Japanese 33rd Division was crossing the Chindwin River in strength. The Yugo offensive had begun. Tokyo's plan was ambitious. Seize Imphal, cut the supply line to northern Burma, destroy 14th Army, and open the road to India. The Japanese committed 3 divisions, roughly 85,000 men, supported by artillery and a handful of light tanks. They carried rations for 3 weeks, gambling that captured British supplies would sustain the offensive beyond that point. 14th Army's defense rested on firepower. General Slim had learned the lessons of earlier retreats. This time, there would be no withdrawal. Positions would be held, supplied by air if necessary, and supported by every available gun. The artillery order of battle included 25-pounder field guns, 5.5-inch medium guns, 7.2-inch howitzers, 3.7-inch mountain howitzers, a different weapon entirely designed for pack transport, and, where roads allowed, the 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns in ground support. The first test came quickly. Japanese forces probed the TMU Imphal Road, seeking weak points. Their tactics relied on infiltration, night movement, and concentrated assault at dawn. British positions relied on depth, interlocking fields of fire, and artillery support. Counter-battery fire became critical. Japanese mortars, well-sighted and skillfully employed, harassed British positions day and night. Suppressing them required precision and volume. A counter-battery log from mid-March recorded the mission: airburst fire on suspected mortar lines, grid coordinates provided by forward observers, time on target concentration by multiple batteries. The 3.7-inch guns fired 20 rounds each over 15 minutes. The shells climbed, fuses armed, and burst 30 feet above the target area. Shrapnel swept trenches and gun pits. Observers reported secondary explosions and reduced mortar activity for the next 6 hours. The mission was repeated daily, adapted to new coordinates as Japanese positions shifted. The contrast was stark. Routine 25-pounder high-explosive shells, fired for direct effect, cratered earth and splintered timber but often left bunkers intact. Airburst from heavy guns imposed a lethal umbrella over open ground, trenches, and lightly covered positions. Japanese troops could not ignore it. They could not dig deeper fast enough. They could not shift positions without exposure. The 3.7-inch gun, designed to reach bombers at 30,000 feet, now delivered its payload at ranges measured in thousands of yards, with effects measured in disrupted attacks and silenced mortars. Forward observers adjusted fire using map coordinates, compass bearings, and radio communications. The process was methodical. Observer identifies target, radio's grid and description, battery plots data, predictor calculates fuse setting, guns fire, observer adjusts, repeat. In ideal conditions, the cycle took minutes. In jungle conditions, with limited visibility and degraded communications, it took longer. But the system worked. British artillery doctrine emphasized flexibility, and the 3.7-inch gun fit that doctrine. Japanese infantry assaults faced not only small arms fire and grenades, but also planned defensive fires. Pre-registered targets covered approach routes, forming up areas and likely avenues of advance. When attacks developed, artillery could respond immediately. The 3.7-inch contributed to these fire plans, its high-velocity shells arriving with flat trajectory and sudden impact. The sound alone, a sharp crack followed by the roar of detonation, had psychological effect. Survivors later described it as unnatural, like something from naval bombardment, incongruous in jungle terrain. By late March, the pattern was clear. Where 3.7-inch HAA guns were sighted and supplied, they added weight and precision to British artillery. They did not replace lighter guns. They complemented them. 25-pounders provided volume and flexibility. Medium guns delivered heavy blows at range. Mountain howitzers operated where roads did not exist. The 3.7-inch offered high velocity, flat trajectory, and effective airburst, a niche role but valuable where applicable. The jungle had not changed. The tools available to fight in it had expanded. A gun meant for the stratosphere was earning its place at treeline. The road from Dimapur to Imphal stretched 132 miles through mountains, jungle, and river crossings. It was the only ground supply line to 14th Army's forward positions. Japanese forces sought to cut it. British engineers fought to keep it open. The road became the campaign's central fact. Hold it and Imphal could be supplied. Lose it and the garrison would starve. Moving a 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft gun along this road was an exercise in controlled chaos. The weapon and its traveling carriage weighed 9 to 10 tons. The limber towed behind added more. Ammunition convoys followed. Lorries stacked with wooden crates, each holding shells and cartridges, fuses packed separately, powder charges wrapped in protective covers. A single battery's move required multiple vehicles, engineer support, and precise scheduling. Movement tables governed every detail. Axle loads determined which bridges could be crossed. Winching sites were marked on maps, with engineers prepositioning steel cables and anchors at steep grades. Bridge classifications, Class 9, Class 12, limited which spans could bear the gun's weight. Fording depths were noted where bridges had been destroyed. Convoy standard operating procedures capped speeds to single digits during monsoon rains, when mud turned roads into traps and visibility shrank to yards. The monsoon arrived in late April. Rain fell in sheets. Roads became rivers of mud. Vehicles bogged down, requiring recovery by tractor or man-hauled winches. Bridge approaches washed out. Culverts overflowed. Landslides blocked sections overnight. Yet the convoys moved. Royal engineers cleared debris, rebuilt spans, laid corduroy matting over soft ground. The Royal Army Service Corps drove the lorries, maintained schedules, and delivered ammunition. Without this logistic system, no artillery, light or heavy, could have functioned. Where 3.7-inch guns were sighted, ammunition allocation reflected their firing rates and mission profiles. A battery might receive 50 rounds per gun per day for sustained operations, more during active phases, less during lulls. This was a fraction of the tonnage allocated to 25-pounders, which fired thousands of rounds daily army-wide, but significant for a weapon firing 28-pound shells. Stockpiles built at roadheads and defensive positions, guarded and camouflaged, ready for call. The guns themselves required maintenance. Monsoon conditions tested every system. Canvas covers protected recuperators from moisture. Oil sumps were checked daily. Corrosion control became a battle unto itself. Battery sergeants major enforced strict routines. Clean, lubricate, inspect, report. Fitters from the Royal Artillery repaired what they could. Parts were requisitioned from rear depots, delivered when convoys could move them. Availability rates stayed high where maintenance and sighting were sound. Guns that might have been grounded by weather in less disciplined units remained operational through discipline and routine. Platforming was critical. Concrete pads were ideal but rare. Engineers substituted timber balks, railway sleepers salvaged from abandoned lines, or compacted laterite in dry spells. The gun's recoil system absorbed firing shock, but the platform had to remain stable. Poorly prepared positions shifted under repeated fire, degrading accuracy and risking damage. Well-prepared positions lasted weeks, supporting hundreds of rounds without significant drift. Defensive positions at Imphal and along the road incorporated HAA guns where sighting allowed. These were not mobile assets during the siege. They were part of the fixed defense. Their role was to dominate local ground. Interdiction of Japanese supply routes, harassment of assembly areas, countermortar fire, and direct engagement of targets within range. The logistics to sustain them was challenging, but not impossible. Air supply supplemented road convoys when necessary. Dakota transports dropped ammunition by parachute, crated and padded, adding to what convoys delivered. The system held. Japanese forces faced the opposite problem. Their logistics collapsed. Rations ran out. Ammunition grew scarce. Artillery support dwindled. Soldiers weakened from hunger and disease. British firepower, sustained by industrial logistics, wore them down. The 3.7-inch gun was one small part of that firepower, but it contributed. Where roads and sights existed, HAA guns augmented artillery density at critical points. Logistics did not permit massing them everywhere, but where they could be sighted, effects counted. The road was iron in more ways than one. A signals officer at Southeast Asia Command Headquarters slid a translated intercept across the desk. The document, captured from a Japanese signals unit, described artillery fire encountered near the Tidum Road. The phrasing was technical but the message clear. Heavy flat trajectory fire, high velocity, devastating airbursts, unlike anything encountered previously in Burma. One passage stood out. Explosions like naval shells, but from land-based weapons. Log and earth bunkers insufficient. Allied intelligence assessed the report with interest. Japanese forces had faced British 25-pounders and mountain howitzers throughout the campaign. They knew those weapons well, their trajectories, their shell weights, their effects. This description suggested something different. Cross-referencing known artillery deployments identified the likely source, 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns, employed in ground support along sectors where they had been sighted. The Japanese were feeling the impact. Bunker construction had been Japan's tactical edge in jungle warfare. Teak logs, densely grained and resistant to splitting, formed walls 2 to 3 feet thick. Earth-piled overhead absorbed blast. Firing slits, narrow and angled, limited exposure. These positions withstood direct hits from field artillery, forcing British infantry into costly close assault or reliance on flamethrowers and demolition charges. Reducing a well-built bunker could take hours and claim lives. Japanese doctrine emphasized fortification, trusting that time and casualties would erode British will. Airburst changed the equation. A 28-pound high-explosive shell, fused to detonate 30 feet above ground, scattered shrapnel across a wide area. Trenches offered no protection. Log overhead cover, unless extraordinarily thick, could not stop fragmentation traveling at lethal velocity. Bunker firing slits, designed to resist direct fire, became vulnerabilities as shrapnel entered from above. Personnel caught in the open, mortar crews, ammunition carriers, messengers, died or were wounded before they could reach cover. VT proximity fuses, beginning to arrive in theater in limited quantities, increased lethality further. These fuses used radio signals to detect proximity to the ground or target, detonating the shell at optimal height without manual fuse setting. The effect was devastating. Japanese troops described entire positions swept by a single salvo, casualties mounting with no warning, no time to react. The psychological toll matched the physical. Soldiers who survived learned to dread the sound of high-velocity shells inbound, knowing that overhead bursts left nowhere to hide. Direct fire, though rarer, added another dimension. The 3.7-inch gun could engage targets at low elevation when sighting and visibility allowed. At ranges under 2,000 yards, the flat trajectory and high velocity made the gun brutally effective against bunkers presenting flank or frontal aspects. A direct hit by a 28-pound shell at 2,600 feet per second cracked logs, collapsed parapets, and sent shock waves through interior spaces that killed or concussed defenders even when the structure remained standing. Japanese engineering manuals captured later in the war showed revisions prompted by these encounters. Instructions for bunker construction emphasized thicker overhead cover, deeper excavation, and dispersed layouts to minimize casualties from single rounds. The revisions acknowledged what field reports described. Logs alone were not enough. The weapon that Allied forces were bringing to bear demanded adaptation. That weapon, in many cases, was the 3.7-inch HAA gun, repurposed from air defense. Intelligence summaries circulated the findings. Japanese morale, already strained by logistical collapse and disease, suffered further under artillery that they could not counter effectively. Their own artillery, outranged and outgunned, provided diminishing support. Counter-battery fire from British guns, including the 3.7-inch, suppressed Japanese indirect fires and left infantry exposed. The calculus of attrition tilted steadily against them. Firepower, sustained by logistics and applied with precision, imposed a cost the Japanese could not pay. The intercepted reports provided confirmation of what forward observers already knew. The 3.7-inch gun, wherever it operated, influenced the local fight. Could not be everywhere. Could not replace the broader artillery park. But where it was sighted, supplied, and directed, it delivered effects the enemy acknowledged and feared. A gun born for sky defense had become a ground support asset. The jungle had not changed. The tools available to fight in it had. Tokyo's engineers revised their manuals, but revisions could not reverse the campaign's momentum. A staff conference at 14th Army headquarters in June 1944 reviewed lessons from the Imphal battles. The siege had been broken. Japanese forces were in retreat. Allied casualties had been heavy, but sustainable. Japanese casualties had been catastrophic. The campaign demonstrated principles that would guide operations through 1945. Hold ground, supply by air when necessary, and bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Artillery effectiveness was a recurring theme. Staff tables compared predictor settings, fuse error bands, and accuracy data from different weapons. The 3.7-inch HAA gun, in its ground roll, achieved 2 to 3 mil accuracy with trained crews and proper fire control. This precision allowed engagement of small targets, individual bunkers, mortar positions, road junctions, without wasting ammunition on area saturation. Compared to howitzers, which delivered plunging fire with larger dispersion, the flat trajectory high-velocity gun offered a distinct advantage for certain missions. Formal integration into ground support tasks followed. Doctrine writers, drawing on experience from Italy and Northwest Europe, codified procedures for HAA employment in theater. The guns would be assigned interdiction, countermortar, and defensive fire missions when sighted. They would not be held solely for air defense unless the threat justified it. Liaison with forward observers, air observation post units, and infantry would follow standardized protocols. Safety arcs, to prevent friendly fire incidents, would be strictly observed. Ammunition allocation would balance ground support missions against air defense readiness. 656 Squadron, the air observation post unit operating Oster aircraft over Burma, played a crucial role. Their spotting planes circled above battlefields, observing Japanese positions, adjusting artillery fire, and directing counterfire against enemy guns. Integration of HAA guns into the system improved speed to first round and adjustment accuracy. An AOP pilot could identify a target, radio coordinates to an artillery net, and have shells on target within minutes. The 3.7-inch gun, with its high velocity and precision, complemented the system well. Training directives emphasized crew proficiency. Gun crews, originally trained for anti-aircraft fire, adapted to ground missions through practice and repetition. Loading drills remained the same. Fuse setting procedures adapted to ground targets. Elevation and traverse followed map coordinates rather than predicted intercept points. The transition was not instantaneous, but it was achievable. Experienced crews mastered both roles. New crews trained directly for dual-role employment. Standard operating procedures addressed unique challenges. Firing tables for ground missions differed from air defense tables. Ballistic data, compiled from test shoots and field reports, gave crews the information needed to calculate range, elevation, and fuse settings for various targets. Safety considerations included minimum safe distances, danger zones for airbursts, and coordination with infantry to prevent fratricide. Communications protocols ensured artillery nets remained clear and responsive. The doctrine also acknowledged limitations. The 3.7-inch gun was not a universal solution. Its weight restricted mobility. Its ammunition consumption demanded robust logistics. Its crew requirements competed with other artillery needs. Employment would be selective, tied to specific operational conditions. Road-accessible sites, sustained ammunition supply, missions that leveraged high-velocity flat trajectory fire. Where these conditions existed, the gun added value. Where they did not, other assets took priority. General Slim's emphasis on flexibility permeated the doctrine. Commanders at brigade and division level received authority to task HAA guns for ground missions when tactical conditions warranted. Centralized control remained for air defense. Decentralized execution allowed for ground support. The balance reflected lessons learned across theaters. Rigid doctrine failed in fluid combat, but clear procedures enabled effective action. By mid-1944, the 3.7-inch HAA gun had fully transitioned from experimental ground employment to doctrinal integration. In Europe, HAA units were fully part of corps-level fire plans by 1945. In Burma, their use remained opportunistic but persistent where roads and logistics allowed. The jungle had not changed the ballistics. Procedures, born of necessity and refined through experience, made the difference. A weapon system designed for one role had adapted to another, demonstrating the principle that effectiveness depends not only on design but on doctrine, training, and the will to innovate. The monsoon turned jungle into swamp and roads into rivers. Rain fell every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days without pause. Visibility dropped to yards. Aircraft were grounded more often than not. Ground movement slowed to a crawl. Conditions that would have silenced lighter operations merely complicated artillery. The guns, properly maintained, continued to fire. Workshop notes from HAA batteries recorded the routine. Canvas covers protected recuperators from constant moisture. Oil sumps were drained and refilled on schedule. Corrosion checks identified rust before it spread. Fitters scraped, wire brushed, and recoated exposed metal. Recoil systems, critical to the gun's operation, received particular attention. Hydraulic fluid levels were monitored. Seals were inspected. Any sign of leakage meant immediate repair. Platforms, stressed by repeated recoil and soaked by rain, required constant attention. Timber balks shifted under fire, requiring releveling. Drainage ditches prevented water from pooling under the carriage. Sump pits collected rainwater and were pumped or baled daily. Engineers and gun crews worked together, maintaining positions through discipline and routine. Poorly maintained sites degraded quickly. Well-maintained sites endured weeks of monsoon without significant loss of readiness. Battery sergeants major enforced standards. Cleanliness was not cosmetic. It was operational. Mud in the breech mechanism meant stoppages. Water in ammunition crates meant misfires. Rust on traversing gears meant jamming. The work was tedious, performed in rain, repeated daily, and absolutely necessary. Availability rates stayed high where discipline held. Guns that might have been declared unserviceable in less rigorous units remained operational. Air operations suffered more than artillery. Monsoon clouds and rain grounded fighters, bombers, and even observation aircraft for days at a time. Missions planned for air support were cancelled or delayed indefinitely. Infantry and armor, lacking air cover, relied more heavily on artillery. The 3.7-inch guns, sighted and ready, picked up the slack. Missions that would have been handled by strike aircraft fell to ground fire. Interdiction, harassment, and defensive fires continued regardless of weather. Japanese forces faced worse conditions with fewer resources. Their logistics, never robust in Burma, collapsed entirely under monsoon. Supply convoys could not move. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Food ran out. Disease spread through ranks weakened by hunger. Artillery support became sporadic, then ceased almost entirely. British artillery, by contrast, maintained fire. Ammunition arrived by air when roads failed. Stockpiles, prepositioned before the monsoon, sustained operations through the worst weeks. The contrast was operational, not technological. Both sides possessed capable artillery when supplied. Japan's guns were well-designed, their crews trained. But design and training could not overcome logistical failure. British guns fired because ammunition reached them. Japanese guns fell silent because ammunition did not. The monsoon did not favor either side. It tested logistics, and logistics decided the outcome. Defensive positions at Kohima and along the Tidum Road incorporated HAA guns as part of the permanent artillery establishment. These guns, once emplaced, did not move for months. Their role was to dominate ground within range. Harass Japanese positions, disrupt resupply, respond to attacks, and maintain psychological pressure. The missions were routine, repetitive, and effective. Japanese forces, unable to respond with equal fire, endured steady attrition. Forward observers operating in monsoon conditions adjusted fire by map and compass when visibility failed. Radio communications, degraded by weather, required careful procedure and redundancy. Artillery nets used standard formats. Grid coordinates, target description, fuse setting, rounds requested. Crews fired, observers adjusted, repeat. The cycle worked even when observers could not see impacts, relying on sound and reported effects. Precision suffered, but volume compensated. By late July, the monsoon's worst had passed. Skies began to clear. Air operations resumed. Ground movement improved. Japanese forces, reduced by casualties, disease, and starvation, withdrew across the Chindwin. 14th Army prepared to advance. The 3.7-inch HAA guns, which had stood through monsoon in fixed positions, would soon redeploy forward as roads allowed. Maintenance crews inspected barrels, checked recoil systems, and certified guns ready for movement. The monsoon had tested everything. Discipline and logistics had prevailed. Weather grounded aircraft but did not silence guns. Where preparation met persistence, capability endured. Kohima was a road junction and supply depot, not a fortress. Its defenses were improvised. Trenches dug into hillsides, bunkers fashioned from timber and sandbags, wires strung around perimeters. The garrison, 161st Indian Brigade, numbered roughly 2,500 men. Japanese forces attacking numbered over 15,000. The siege began on 4 April 1944 and lasted 79 days. Geography, logistics, and firepower decided the outcome. The perimeter contracted to absurd dimensions. At its smallest, the defensive line included the district commissioner's tennis court, a patch of ground 110 feet by 48 feet. Japanese forces held positions yards away. Snipers exchanged fire at point-blank range. Grenades sailed across the court. Dead lay unburied in no man's land. Resupply came by airdrop, parachutes landing inside the perimeter or just beyond, recovered under fire. Water came from a single spring, contested and rationed. The siege compressed combat to medieval intimacy overlaid with industrial firepower. Artillery provided the margin of survival. British 25-pounders, sighted outside the perimeter but within range, fired defensive concentrations on Japanese approach routes. 3.7-inch mountain howitzers, distinct from the HAA gun, these were pack weapons designed for steep terrain, engaged bunkers at close range, often firing over open sites. Tanks, including Lee Grant mediums, fought at the tennis court itself, blasting bunkers at ranges measured in feet. And where sighting allowed, 3.7-inch HAA guns delivered airburst over Japanese assembly areas and mortar positions. Air observation post aircraft, when weather permitted, circled above ridgelines. Pilots identified targets, radioed coordinates, and adjusted fire. The process was continuous. Observe, report, fire, adjust, repeat. Japanese forces, lacking equivalent support, relied on visual observation and slower communications. British artillery responded faster, hit harder, and sustained fire longer. The imbalance was cumulative. Airbursts imposed a lethal umbrella over Japanese positions. Shells fused to detonate 30 feet above ground scattered shrapnel through trenches and over bunker roofs. Mortar crews, exposed while serving their weapons, suffered heavily. Infantry, forming for assault, took casualties before reaching British lines. The psychological effect was profound. Constant bombardment, no respite, losses that could not be replaced. Japanese medical services, overwhelmed and under fire, could not evacuate wounded. Casualties accumulated. Point targets, individual bunkers, machine gun nests required different tools. Mountain howitzers and tank guns handled these with direct fire. Flamethrowers and demolition charges finished what shells could not crack. Infantry assaults, coordinated with artillery, cleared positions one by one. The work was brutal, costly, and methodical. Artillery set conditions. Infantry closed and finished. The tennis court fight, remembered for its infantry valor, was decided by layered fires. HAA airburst plus field and mountain guns plus armor. Japanese forces attacked repeatedly. Each assault followed preparation by their own artillery and mortars. Each met defensive fire from British guns. The pattern repeated for weeks. Japanese ammunition expenditure outpaced resupply. British ammunition, delivered by air and later by road when relief forces broke through, sustained continuous fire. Attrition favored the defender. By late May, Japanese attacks weakened. By mid-June, the siege was broken. Japanese forces withdrew, leaving thousands dead. The relief column, advancing from Dimapur, brought not only infantry and armor but also artillery and logistics. Kohima became a forward base. Supplies stockpiled. Guns redeployed. The road to Imphal reopened. The campaign's crisis had passed. Firepower, more than any single factor, had held the line. Artillery of all types, field guns, mountain howitzers, medium guns, and the opportunistically employed HAA pieces, had blunted Japanese attacks, imposed costs the enemy could not bear, and preserved the perimeter until relief arrived. In a battle remembered for infantry endurance and close-quarters combat, artillery geometry decided the tempo. The 3.7-inch HAA gun, designed for sky defense, contributed to that geometry where sighted. Its role was not exclusive. It was not decisive in isolation, but as part of a layered fire system, it added weight and precision that shaped outcomes. The tennis court became a symbol. The artillery that defended it became a case study. Kohima held because logistics, firepower, and will converged. A gun born for altitude played its part at ridgeline. Japanese armor in Burma consisted primarily of Type 95 Hago light tanks and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. The Hago weighed 7.4 tons, mounted a 37mm gun, and featured armor 12mm thick at the front. The Chiha weighed 15 tons, carried a 57mm gun, and had 25mm frontal armor. Both were obsolete by 1944 standards, outmatched by Allied armor and vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. Yet in jungle terrain, where roads constrained movement and visibility limited engagement ranges, even light tanks posed tactical problems. British anti-tank doctrine relied on layered defense. Infantry carried anti-tank rifles, later replaced by PIAT, projector infantry anti-tank launchers firing shape charge bombs. Anti-tank troops deployed 6-pounder guns, 57mm, capable of defeating most Japanese armor at typical engagement ranges. 17-pounder guns, 76.2mm, provided heavier firepower where mobility allowed. Tanks engaged tanks when both were present. The system worked, but it depended on early detection and favorable positioning. The 3.7-inch HAA gun was never a standard anti-tank weapon in Burma. Its primary ground roles were airburst, interdiction, and countermortar fire. But ballistics are ballistics, and the gun's characteristics made ad hoc direct fire possible under favorable conditions. A 28-pound shell at 2,600 feet per second, fired from a high-velocity 94mm gun, could defeat 12mm armor at virtually any practical range. Against 25mm armor, penetration remained likely at ranges under 2,000 yards, particularly if the round struck at near-perpendicular incidents. Documented examples of HAA guns engaging armor in direct fire exist from other theaters. In North Africa, desperate improvisation led to anti-aircraft guns firing at German tanks during fluid battles. In Europe, 3.7-inch guns occasionally engaged armored vehicles when opportunity arose, though this was never their primary role. Mobility and mounting constraints limited such employment. The gun's carriage, designed for high-angle fire, allowed low-elevation traverse, but sighting, concealment, and rapid response were challenging. Dedicated anti-tank guns handled the mission better. In Burma, the HAA gun's direct fire potential added a psychological dimension. Japanese armor, advancing along roads, faced an array of threats. Infantry anti-tank weapons, concealed 6-pounders, 17-pounders if present, Allied tanks if deployed, and the occasional heavy piece sighted to cover a roadblock or choke point. The knowledge that even an HAA gun might engage at low elevation complicated Japanese planning. Certainty of survival decreased. Tactics grew more cautious. Advantage shifted further toward defense. Road interdiction became a subset of the broader mission. Roadblocks, registered by artillery, could be engaged by any available gun. If a 3.7-inch HAA piece had line of sight and the tactical situation warranted, it could fire. The effect was not statistical, such engagements were rare, but the capability existed. Liaison notes between HAA battery commanders and anti-tank troop leaders discussed procedures for such contingencies. If an armored car or light tank appeared at a registered point, and dedicated anti-tank assets were not immediately available, the HAA gun could engage. Analytic pieces stress the 3.7-inch was rarely used as a dedicated anti-tank gun, primarily due to mobility and mounting constraints. It could not maneuver like a 6-pounder on a portee truck or a towed 17-pounder. Could not hide like a PIAT team. It was conspicuous, slow to move, and dependent on prepared positions. But where it was sighted and if the situation demanded, it could fire. The capability, even if seldom exercised, influenced calculations. The 3.7-inch never became an 88 in Burma. The comparison to Germany's legendary dual-role gun was unwarranted. The 88mm flak gun was purpose-designed for dual-role from the outset, mounted on a carriage optimized for rapid low-elevation traverse, and employed systematically as an anti-tank weapon throughout the war. The 3.7-inch was adapted opportunistically, its ground role secondary, and its anti-tank employment rare. But its presence altered the tactical environment, adding one more threat to an already unfavorable situation for Japanese armor. The gun's flexibility, born of high performance and all-around traverse, ensured it could contribute even in roles never envisioned by its designers. Statistical annexes arrived at General Headquarters India in October 1944, summarizing the Yugo offensive's outcome. Japanese casualties, 53,000 men, including 13,000 killed and 40,000 sick or wounded. Equipment losses included tanks, artillery pieces, vehicles, and thousands of small arms. British and Indian casualties, 16,000, serious but sustainable and rapidly replaced. The ratio spoke for itself. Japan had gambled on a decisive offensive and lost catastrophically. Artillery expenditure data filled columns. 14th Army had fired hundreds of thousands of rounds during the campaign. 25-pounders, the workhorses of field artillery, accounted for the majority. Medium guns and mountain howitzers added weight and flexibility. The 3.7-inch HAA guns, where deployed, contributed thousands of rounds to missions ranging from airburst to interdiction to direct fire. Ammunition tonnage delivered to these batteries was a fraction of the Army's total, but significant for the units they supported. Staff notes flagged a broader conclusion. Artillery density and coordination had been central to defeating Yugo. Japanese forces, brave and determined, lacked equivalent firepower. Their artillery, initially effective, dwindled as ammunition ran short and counter-battery fire destroyed guns and crews. British artillery, sustained by logistics and directed by forward observers and AOP aircraft, dominated the battlefield. The campaign demonstrated principles that would guide operations through 1945. Maintain fire support, integrate all available assets, and rely on logistics to sustain tempo. The HAA gun's role in this broader system was clear. It had not been decisive in isolation. No single weapon system ever is. But as part of a combined artillery park, it added capabilities that enhanced overall effectiveness. Its high-velocity flat-trajectory fire complemented the plunging fire of howitzers. Its airburst precision reduced the need for saturation bombardment. Its presence at critical points provided commanders with flexible options. Where logistics permitted its deployment, the gun contributed. General Slim's assessment, recorded in post-campaign summaries, emphasized flexibility and combined arms. The victory at Imphal and Kohima resulted from infantry courage, armor mobility, air superiority, engineer work, logistics prowess, and artillery firepower working in concert. Isolating any one factor missed the point. The system won, not individual components. The 3.7-inch HAA gun was part of that system. Transition to pursuit and counteroffensive followed. Japanese forces withdrew across the Chindwin, harassed by British patrols and airstrikes. 14th Army prepared to advance, consolidating positions, stockpiling supplies, and redeploying artillery. HAA guns, where they had been static during the siege, now moved forward as roads were cleared and logistics extended. The campaign's next phase would involve river crossings, long-range movement, and pursuit of a broken enemy. Artillery would follow, supporting infantry and armor as always. Doctrine evolved from experience. The 3.7-inch HAA gun's ground role, proven in Burma as in Italy and Europe, informed post-war planning. Future systems would emphasize dual-role capability. Flexible mounts, improved fire control, and logistics planning would enable rapid shifts between air defense and ground support. The gun itself, a product of 1920s thinking, had demonstrated adaptability beyond its original design. The lesson was clear. Capability is not fixed at the factory. It evolves through doctrine, training, and operational imagination. Ammunition resources shifted as priorities changed. With the air threat over Burma negligible by late 1944, HAA ammunition allocations increasingly supported ground missions. Fuse stocks, once reserved for air defense, were redirected. Maintenance resources followed. The transition was not absolute. Air defense remained a mission, but the balance tilted toward ground support. The flexibility that doctrine enabled, logistics sustained. With the Yugo offensive blunted, 14th Army advanced. The Chindwin River, once a Japanese supply line, became a barrier they could not hold. British forces crossed in strength, pushing toward Mandalay and Rangoon. Japanese resistance continued, but momentum had shifted. The campaign that followed would be one of pursuit, not defense. Artillery would support advances, not sieges. The 3.7-inch HAA gun would remain part of the artillery park where roads allowed, continuing its dual role as opportunity and necessity dictated. The frontier held because firepower, not just courage, carried the burden in the worst weather. Artillery, including the opportunistically employed HAA guns, delivered effects that infantry valor alone could not achieve. The campaign demonstrated that in modern war, industrial capacity and logistical depth matter as much as tactical skill. Japan had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage, but because its system could not sustain them. Britain won because its system could. The 3.7-inch gun, born for sky defense, had helped shape that victory on the ground. Post-war committees convened at the War Office and Royal Artillery establishments to assess lessons learned. Reports stacked on committee tables. Comparative effectiveness studies, ammunition expenditure analyses, casualty data correlated with fire missions. The 3.7-inch HAA gun's performance in ground roles received particular attention. Its dual employment, born of necessity and refined through experience, offered insights for future doctrine. Test reports compared the 3.7-inch HAA gun against 5.5-inch medium guns for specific missions. Airburst over personnel. The HAA gun delivered equivalent or superior effects per round due to higher velocity and flatter trajectory, which reduced fuse setting error. Interdiction of roads and choke points. The HAA gun's precision allowed engagement of small targets with fewer rounds. Counter-battery fire. The HAA gun's high velocity enabled rapid time-on-target missions, though medium guns delivered heavier explosive weight per shell. Ammunition expenditure per target effect became a metric of efficiency. The HAA gun consumed 28-pound shells at rates of 10 to 20 rounds per minute. Medium guns fired heavier shells at slower rates. In missions where precision mattered more than weight of fire, the HAA gun offered advantages. In missions requiring sustained bombardment or maximum destructive effect, medium guns retained their role. The conclusion: different tools for different tasks, with the HAA gun filling a niche between field guns and heavy pieces. The air threat's decline, documented through sortie counts and intercept records, drove the doctrinal shift. Over Britain, Luftwaffe raids had ceased entirely by 1944. Over Europe, German air activity remained significant but diminishing, constrained by fuel shortages and attrition. In the Pacific and Burma, Japanese air power collapsed under Allied pressure. HAA guns, once vital for homeland defense and theater protection, increasingly found themselves defending against targets that did not materialize. Redeployment to ground roles became not just opportunistic but systematic. In Northwest Europe, by 1945, HAA units were fully integrated into corps-level fire plans. They received ground support missions as primary taskings, reverting to air defense only when air threats justified it. In Burma, integration was less formal but persistent where logistics allowed. The pattern was global. As the air threat receded, HAA guns transitioned to ground fire. Lessons learned informed future development. Dual-role thinking became a procurement priority. Gun systems designed exclusively for air defense or ground fire were seen as inefficient. Future weapons would emphasize flexibility. Mounts capable of both high and low-angle fire, fire control systems adaptable to air and ground targets, logistics and training that supported both missions. The 3.7-inch gun's wartime service provided the case study that shaped this thinking. But the future would not be guns at all. By 1950, guided missiles were emerging as the next generation of air defense. Surface-to-air missiles offered advantages no gun could match. Longer range, higher speed, greater lethality against fast high-altitude targets. The 3.7-inch gun and heavy anti-aircraft guns generally were entering obsolescence. Their ground role could not justify retaining systems designed primarily for air defense when air defense itself was transitioning to missiles. Committees documented the gun's service with respect. It had defended British cities during the Blitz. It had protected ports and supply lines across theaters. It had adapted to ground roles when air threats declined. It had served in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. It had fired millions of rounds. It had trained tens of thousands of gunners. It had done what was asked of it, and more. The doctrine and procurement debates of 1945 to 1950 reflected lessons learned, but also looked forward. Artillery's future lay in greater range, improved accuracy, and flexible employment. Guided munitions, even in their infancy, offered revolutionary potential. The gun's era was closing, even as its legacy shaped what came next. The 3.7-inch HAA gun's final contribution was conceptual. It proved that flexibility and adaptation matter as much as original design. The next generation wouldn't be guns, it would be missiles. But the principle of dual-role capability, validated by wartime improvisation, would endure. A final proof shoot at Shubarines Ranges, summer 1956. A 3.7-inch HAA gun, barrel worn but serviceable, was elevated to 45 degrees. Crews, some veterans of wartime service, others trained post-war, executed the firing sequence with practiced precision. The round climbed, arced, and fell into the test zone. Instrumentation recorded barrel wear, dispersion, and fuse function. The data went into files that would inform decommissioning decisions and historical records. The gun's operational service was ending. Retirement came quietly. By the late 1950s, most 3.7-inch HAA guns had been withdrawn from active British service. Some were sold to Commonwealth nations, where they served into the 1960s. Others were scrapped, their steel recycled. A few were preserved, in museums, at military installations as monuments. They stood as artifacts of a specific technological moment, when air defense depended on guns, predictors, and human crews, before missiles and computers rendered them obsolete. The gun's career spanned 2 decades of rapid change. 1937. Introduction, driven by fears of bomber raids. 1940. The Blitz, validation of the gun's air defense role. 1942. The air threat recedes over Britain, prompting doctrinal reassessment. 1943. Ground role experiments in North Africa and Italy. 1944. Full integration into ground support missions in Europe and selective employment in Burma. 1945. Continued dual-role service as the war concluded. 1956. Retirement. The transition to missiles was inevitable. Surface-to-air missiles like the Bristol Bloodhound and later systems offered capabilities no gun could provide. Engagement ranges measured in tens of miles, speeds exceeding Mach 2, guidance systems that tracked and adjusted to evasive targets. The human crew, the mechanical predictor, the timed fuse, all were replaced by electronics, radar, and proximity-fused warheads. The gun's mechanical complexity, once a strength, became a liability. Missiles were simpler operationally, even as their technology was more advanced. Historical summaries of the 3.7-inch gun's service emphasize its adaptability. Designed for air defense, it served in that role effectively throughout the war. Adapted for ground support, it contributed to victories in multiple theaters. The gun operated in deserts, jungles, mountains, and European plains. It defended cities, supported armies, and engaged targets from sea level to stratosphere. Its crews came from Britain, India, Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth nations. Its ammunition was fired in millions of rounds. Its legacy, measured not just in targets destroyed but in tactical flexibility proven, shaped post-war thinking. The Burma campaign, specifically, illustrated the gun's ground potential. While the 3.7-inch mountain howitzer handled most bunker reduction and the 25-pounder provided the bulk of field artillery support, the HAA gun filled a niche: high-velocity airburst, precision interdiction, and opportunistic direct fire. Where roads allowed deployment and logistics sustained operations, the gun contributed to British and Indian artillery's dominance over Japanese forces. The campaign demonstrated that weapons designed for one role could adapt to others when doctrine, training, and logistics enabled the transition. Anti-Aircraft Command, which had overseen the gun's wartime employment, disbanded in 1955. Its mission, protecting the United Kingdom from air attack, transitioned to the Royal Air Force and missile-equipped air defense units. The 3.7-inch gun, the command's primary weapon, passed into history with it. Schools continued to teach its operation for a time, training gunners for Commonwealth units still equipped with the system. By the 1960s, that training ceased. The gun became a museum piece, its story preserved in documents, photographs, and the memories of those who served it. History remembers what a weapon was built to do. Results remember what it actually did. The 3.7-inch HAA gun was built to defend cities from bombers. It did that through the Blitz and beyond. But it also adapted to ground support, proving that effectiveness depends on doctrine and employment as much as design. The gun served in all theaters, engaged targets from sky to earth, and contributed to Allied victory in roles its designers never envisioned. That adaptability, that capacity to respond to operational needs beyond original specifications, remains its legacy. Steel and mechanism, yes, but also flexibility and imagination. The 3.7-inch gun story is one of tools meeting tasks, and soldiers making both work. The British 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft gun entered service as an air defense weapon and concluded its career as proof that capability extends beyond original design. From the Blitz to Burma, from stratosphere to treeline, it adapted. Doctrine evolved. Crews trained. Logistics sustained. The gun fired. In 1944, when Japanese forces attacked Imphal and Kohima, artillery of all types, field guns, mountain howitzers, medium pieces, and opportunistically employed HAA guns, delivered the firepower that held the line. The 3.7-inch was one tool among many. It was not everywhere. It was not decisive alone. But where it was sighted, supplied, and directed, it contributed. That contribution, measured not in headlines but in missions fired and targets suppressed, helped shape the campaign's outcome. The jungle did not change. The tools available to fight in it expanded. A gun born for the sky earned its place at ground level. History records the result. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.